To determine what things are actually underrated in this game is practically impossible because you have to know everybody's opinion on basically everything. And for the most part, when people talk about the most underrated thing, they typically mean the things that are just not really talked about as much or things that are maybe underused. Like for example, let's talk about the pickaxe. This is an amazing great hammer. It's a weapon that works very similar to the rusted anchor, which is like a known S tier option, but this one actually does more stance damage, but in return it gets a little bit of less of just regular damage. And the people that actually know about the pickaxe would actually rate it high, but it's still not really used as much. So just because something really isn't used as much, does that really mean that it's underrated? I would probably say yes. So that's basically going to be the criteria for this list. It's things that I think are just not really used as much, or things that people don't really know that much about, and I just want to help highlight those things. Now I'm going to have like 10 different categories going over things like weapons, spells, ashes of war, even like build types. And it's picked like the most underrated one for every single category in my opinion. And yes, it is just going to be for PvE. The most underrated incantation in Elden Ring I am going to give to the Flame of Frenzy. There were like a few other options I was like thinking about, like Fire Serpent, Beast Claw, Flameful upon them. I'm not really too sure people actually rank these spells, but the Flame of Frenzy is definitely a spell I don't really see used enough, as it is going to be one of the better AoE projectiles in this game, because this spell does go incredibly far, especially when you do have it locked off. It covers a nice range, so it's good at hitting multiple enemies. It can be fully charged to do amazing damage, especially when paired alongside things like the Godfrey's icon, and when it is fully charged, you could potentially do over 50 stance damage with this spell. And on top of all that, it only costs 16 FP, has a 16 faith requirement, and you get it really early in the game, like only in the Weeping Peninsula. Now it obviously does have some downsides. One, it is going to be somewhat of a longer animation if you do have it fully charged, and you can't really move around while using it. And unfortunately, just like all the madness spells, it does do some madness build up to yourself. So it's not like you can really spam this over and over again. But the fact that it actually can serve as a really long range projectile attack, an AoE spell, and a high stance damaging spell as well, for very little FP cost and very little investment, you can argue that this is an S tier spell. The most underrated sorcery in Elden Ring I am going to give to Crystal Release, which yet it kind of makes a little bit of sense why people don't really use it as much. It consumes 34 FP, has a 41 intelligence requirement, it's a close range spell with like a longer animation, but the thing is, the damage is just insane. The spell practically melts every single enemy, and although it does have a longer animation, the first part of it actually does give you some hyper armor to where you actually can tank a whole bunch of attacks. Now the second part of the animation doesn't get hyper armor, but that's perfectly fine because if you get staggered out of it, the AoE crystals are still guaranteed to come out. And if the whole thing connects, it's just destroying everything. And the fact that it is a spell that doesn't require you to move and it is like a close range type of spell, things like Terra Magica might be a pretty decent pairing. And then all of a sudden, that 34 FP cost looks very cheap. The most underrated weapon in the DLC is going to go to the Smith Script Daggers, which this is pretty much an easy layup for me. As much as I did want to talk about things like the Golem Fists or the Blood Fiend's Fork again, like every single ranking video I see just has the Smith Script Daggers listed pretty low. Like even my old videos had it ranking at the bottom. But no, the thing is genuinely good. If you want to know how to make it good, number one, don't use status effects because it makes the damage terrible and the status buildup is awful. Just leave it keen infused all onto dexterity and just stay at a further distance and then spam away. Like the range is actually really good to where you don't have to engage with enemies. It attacks pretty quickly, especially since like the heavy attack changes to where you actually can go into like the uncharged heavy attack into light attack combo, and it gets boosted by so many talismans, multi-hit talismans, smithing talisman, arrow reach, the spear talisman, because yes, it does do piercing damage, and you're probably going to benefit the most off of counter damage with this particular weapon, more so than anything else in the game, because you can sit at a distance to where you just bait enemy attacks out, and in most cases, you're going to get a counter hit, which with the spear talisman is over 30% more damage. Like yes, it's not going to melt enemies super quickly, yes, enemies can input read it and dodge it pretty nicely, but that's where the scatter shot throw weapon skill comes into play, because it does complement the weapon perfectly as an option to just like hit enemies that like to dodge or move around, or multiple enemies at once, and that actually can perform pretty good as like an offhand option, just like leaving it in your left hand, and when enemies get a bit further away from you, you can just click the light attack a couple times to stop them from regenerating poise, or just keep the buffs of your multi-hit talismans active. The thing is genuinely good. The most underrated weapon in the base game is definitely tough to choose because it's hard to tell where people actually rank certain types of weapons. I wanted to talk about stuff like the Erdsteel Dagger, Spiked Club, the Lucerne. Those things are all pretty underrated weapons, but I decided to settle on the Warped Axe. Which for the people that use axes, you probably already know about the warped axe being amazing. But not many people do use axes, and the warped axe you do have to farm for. So not everybody really knows its full potential, because this thing at best could be one of the highest two-handed DPS in the entire game. Which yes, when it does come to DPS, typically power stancing combos for certain weapon types will end up just being better. But sometimes power stancing can be a bit inconvenient, and in those cases where you just want a two-handed weapon, the warped axe is one of the best. Because this thing with its S scaling and strength can get ridiculous damage with a strength-based build, and it's to the point that it can even out-damage great hammers. And it's not just out-damaging great hammers and being an axe, it's actually an axe with the fastest moveset. Like the warped axe is the highest damaging axe with the fastest light attack combos, and these light attack combos can be honestly just as fast as a curved sword. So when you really look at it, it's a weapon that gets just as fast as a moveset as a curved sword, but the damage of a great hammer. Now the unfortunate downside is that it does consume basically just as much stamina as a great hammer. So I would pair this with a build that has like a little bit more endurance than you otherwise normally would, but the benefits are just insane. You get like ridiculous amounts of damage. And also the warped axe gets bonus status effect build up when you do go with these like status effect infusions like bleed or cold for some reason. Like this thing with a bleed infusion gets an A scaling in strength and gets just as much bleed build up as a great sword, while being a weapon that's just as fast as a curved sword. Like the thing is pretty ridiculous. The most underrated talisman in this game I'm going to give to the Crusade Insignia. As much as I want to talk about things like the Crimson Sea talisman again, I'm pretty sure I've talked about it enough where people actually know how broken it is. But the Crusade Insignia doesn't really get enough love, because this talisman is pretty much a perpetual 15% damage buff. When you get a kill on an enemy, that's 15% more damage to all of your sources, weapons, spells, ashes, doesn't matter what it is, for 20 seconds. And with how many enemies there are in this game, between grace to grace and like dungeons or legacy dungeons, that's just a free damage buff. Now obviously if you're doing like successive playthroughs and you're just running from boss to boss, or just in a boss fight itself, obviously going to be useless. But any single time that you're actually taking your time to kill enemies, this is literally the best damaging talisman to use, because it's just as much of a boost as things like the Shard of Alexander, but it's to everything, and it stacks with everything too. The most underrated Asher War in this game is also a pretty tough one to choose from. As much as I wanted to talk about things like Enduro or like my beloved Phantom Slash, I'm gonna have to give it to Prayerful Strike. This thing is like a high S tier Asher War, and it is like broken for like most types of builds, and more people just need to use it. I think the reason why most people kind of stray away from it is because I think it's just for faith-based builds. Yes, it actually is like a sacred Ash of War, so unfortunately you can't pair it alongside things like an intelligence build or like an arcane build, but you still can pair it alongside a strength, dexterity, or quality build, and it's not going to be doing any types of holy damage at all. The damage of the skill is just going to be based on your AR. And what the skill actually does do is serve as like a hard-hitting downward slam attack that gets really good hyper armor, flattens enemies to the ground, does decent damage, can do up to 36 stance damage depending on the weapon type, but it also heals for 30% of your max HP, which is just ridiculous. You heal a third of your health every single time that you hit with this skill, and it only consumes 20 FP. And once again, it's not like this thing does bad damage. You can just slap it onto a big giant crusher, make it do amazing damage, have it do respectable stance damage, get yourself some nice hyper armor, and it single-handedly makes this skill like the best trading-based skill in the game. Like if you are using like a strength-based weapon and you're like in later new games and you're struggling to kill certain bosses because they're hitting super hard, I would just use this thing. Now, as for the most underrated unique skill in Elden Ring, I'm going to give it to the Sorcery of the Krazier, which this is a skill of the Watchdog Staff, and this is a colossal weapon, pretty average damaging colossal weapon, doesn't get an intelligence-based scaling. So unfortunately, there are no stats that you can use to boost the damage of this skill, but the skill is still broken. This is a magic damaging tracking projectile attack that goes really far, has a quick casting animation, only consumes 15 FP, does 12 stance damage, and for some reason, it's invisible to enemies too. Like enemies don't input read it, Radagon doesn't try to parry it. Like it pretty much is like the skill-based version of Knight's Comet, but the thing is it's going to be cheaper than Knight's Comet, and it's not even require any of your damaging stats to actually help do decent damage. Like just slap on the Shard of Alexander and then spam away. Like this thing is that easy. Now the next category I want to cover is the most underrated weapon class, which it did come down to two different classes in my opinion. It was the Great Hammers or the Claws, and I decided to go with the Claws. Now I didn't really think that this weapon was going to be that underrated until I did like a poll on my YouTube channel where the Claws actually ended up getting lowest on this list, which to be fair, the other options are all really good, but the Claws are just amazing and one of the easiest weapons to use. Like these offer some of the highest DPS in the entire game, pretty much right next to the Power Stance Curve Swords. Like a Power Stance Bandit's Curve Swords might just end up being better than like Claws when it comes to DPS. And with things like the Power Stancing jumping attacks and the running attacks that the Curve Swords have to offer, they might just end up being better options, but the Claws do have some things going for them that might make people value them over the Curve Swords. One, they're lighter. Two, they actually offer another damage type in piercing damage alongside slashing damage, which makes them good if you're fighting enemies weaker to piercing damage, and it lets you have more skill-based options as well, useful, like Impaling Thrust. There are also going to have like faster light attack combos too. So sometimes there are going to be openings to where you can punish with a claw, but you couldn't with the curved swords. The claws also do get higher crit damage, but most importantly, the claws are paired weapons. Therefore, when you two-hand them, they're going to gain the power stancing or that dual-wielding combo. And the benefits for that is that one, you don't have to go find a second weapon and level up that second weapon. Paired weapons also get an extended moveset as well, with things like jumping heavy light attacks and running heavy and light attacks. But most importantly is that when you do buff them, it adds the buff onto both hands, which is extremely beneficial to the claws because most of the claws do come with bleed, which makes them an obvious pairing with things like Blood Flame Blade. And when using Blood Flame Blade, it adds it onto your left and your right hand, where if you're going to power stance weapons, it's only going to add it onto the right hand. So you're going to be benefiting of almost twice as much bleed build up than you otherwise normally would. So yeah, when it does come to ease of use, versatility when it does come to damage types, or being paired with dexterity builds or arcane builds, and like insane amounts of DPS, the claws are literally one of the best weapon types in this entire game. The crystal tiers. It's kind of hard to pick the most underrated one because it feels like everyone already knows about the best crystal tiers in the game. Because one, there's not that many and you only really get 2 slots. Like all the ones that boost your damage are like the best crystal tiers in the game because they can boost it by so much more. And in terms of like the other crystal tiers that don't boost your damage, it pretty much just goes down to like the opaline tier and the green burst crystal tier. And outside of those, I don't really recommend using anything else. But if I were to pick one, it would be the Windy Crystal tier, which this crystal tier does actually improve your dodge rolling and give you roughly 20% more iframes. And it actually is pretty noticeable. There's plenty of times where I use this tier, and I just noticed that some attacks don't actually hit me when I dodge at like the wrong time. Now, the unfortunate trade-off is that it does decrease your damage negation by 15%, which unfortunately there's going to be like more cases where you're taking damage more so than you actually benefit off that little bit of missed time dodge, which for like a timed buff, I think this is a bit too drastic. It should have only been like a 5% damage negation nerf. Now, you can very well pair this thing alongside the opaline tier, which is a 15% damage negation buff, and it will just completely balance out. But taking up 2 crystal tier slots just to get 20% more iframes, I don't really think is worth it considering how good some of the other crystal tiers can actually be. But it still is going to be a pretty decent option. Now, the last category I want to cover is like overall build type. Like there's plenty of different types of builds out there, like skill spamming builds, jumping attack builds, charged heavy builds, pure caster builds. But one that I do consider to be very underrated is guard countering builds. I think guard countering builds are just as good as any of the other options that I did list. Now, yes, the deflecting tier can be a big part why these are going to be really good, because this crystal tier itself can just make your guard counters do up to 80% more damage and 50% more stance damage. And this tier can last 5 minutes while also giving your weapons the ability to perfectly block. But even outside of the deflecting tier, just in the regular base game, guard countering builds are really good there too. And that's mainly because that shield based builds can also be very broken. Like if you get yourself a pretty good shield, you can like cheese the entire game because you can like block entire boss combos, especially if you have things like barricade, shield, ash of war. And any single time that you do see an opening, you can just do a guard counter, and depending on the weapon type, you can actually pull off a really fast attack with very high stance damage. Like typically guard counters will end up getting just as much stance damage as like a charged heavy attack, while sometimes actually doing it in a faster animation. Things like hammers, flails, great spears, they can all do really well with like a one-handed guard counter. And when it comes to like two-handed guard counters, stuff like great hammers, colossal weapons, these things can just be broken because not only are they really good at blocking, but they're also going to output some of the highest stance damage and do it in like faster animations and things like a greatsword or a curved greatsword. Like it can really make for some like broken ass combos. And yeah, as I mentioned, it's not only just going to be good in the DLC with the deflecting tier, but also in the base game because the curved sword talisman, which enhances guard counter attacks by 20%, is in Stormveil Castle. So you can very well use it from start to finish. Anyway, that is basically everything I wanted to cover in this one. The next video, I kind of want to do the exact same thing, but just cover the overrated stuff instead, which would probably end up being a lot more interesting, just like shitting on people's favorite things. Probably going to get a lot more dislikes in that video, but it's fine. I'm going to do it anyway, so definitely do subscribe for that, and catch you guys around. Bye.